The Velthera Empire had not known surprise in 400 years. This was not arrogance. It was mathematics. Their sensor web, a living lattice of crystallized nerve fibers strung between 43 star systems, could detect the gravitational whisper of a comet changing direction 2 sectors away. Their warships didn't travel through space, so much as folded, the way an elder folds a letter, pressing distant points together until they touched. Their intelligence apparatus was so refined that they knew about rebellions before the rebels finished their first frustrated sentence. Surprise, to the Velthera, was a concept that belonged to children and primitives. Admiral Senvareth stood at the center of the Undying Throne, the Empire's largest command vessel, watching the star map rotate slowly above his primary eye cluster. 6 pale violet eyes tracked 6 different sectors simultaneously. His secondary eyes, the smaller amber pair beneath his jaw ridge, reviewed casualty projections from the outer belt skirmishes. His tertiary eye, the single black one sealed behind a membrane at the back of his skull, never looked at anything tactical. It looked inward. It watched him. All Velthera commanders had a tertiary eye. It was a biological function that had evolved over millennia of internal political warfare. Ambition, fear, or doubt could not be concealed from your own third eye. It kept you honest in a civilization that rewarded deception everywhere else, ensuring that individuals remained true to their inner selves despite external pressures and societal norms. Right now, Senvareth's tertiary eye was very, very still. That meant he was calm. That would change. Fleet status, he said. His voice was a low harmonic chord. Velthera's speech was always 2 tones simultaneously, a primary meaning and a secondary emotional register. You could lie with words, but the tonal register was involuntary. Every Velthera was, in some sense, always speaking twice. All 40 warships are nominal, said his second, Daraves, a younger female whose secondary tone currently carries faint excitement. She had been excited for 3 cycles about nothing in particular. It was a youth quality. Senvareth found it tolerable. The outer belt colony of Threshnall has formally surrendered. Their planetary governor is requesting. Deny everything he's requesting, Senvareth said. Grant him the title he wants. Titles cost nothing. Yes, Admiral. And the corridor between sectors 11 and 12? Still clear? Completely, sir. Nothing within 4 light hours in any direction. Sensor web confirms. We are entirely. The ship screamed. Not metaphorically. The Undying Throne had acoustic stress sensors embedded in its hull, semi-organic filaments that converted structural strain into auditory signals for the crew's benefit, since Velthera perception was primarily sonic. When something hit the ship hard enough, the ship told you. It screamed now. A deep, resonant, furious sound. Every officer on deck froze. Not because of the scream, because of what had caused it. Something had materialized, not dropped from fold space, not decelerated from sublight, not phased in from any known transit method, simply appeared, hull already moving, weapons already hot, directly alongside the Undying Throne, close enough that the gravitational displacement of its arrival compressed the flagship's outer armor like a fist squeezing wet clay. Senvareth's 6 primary eyes all snapped to the same place for the first time in his career. The tertiary eye, the one that watched inward, went very wide. On the sensor display, the object that had appeared was enormous. Dark. Asymmetrical in a way that felt deliberate. It did not have the swept-back elegance of the Velthera design or the blunt utility of the Kethsoran vessels they'd absorbed decades ago. It looked almost grown rather than built. Organic curves interrupted by brutal right angles, surface textures that shifted between smooth and deeply scarred, as if the ship had lived through things that left marks and had chosen not to repair them. It was a warship. It was not any warship on record. And across the command deck of the Undying Throne, every single tactical screen simultaneously displayed one line of text, not a hail, not a frequency request, not a standard contact protocol, just words, in perfect Imperial script, as if whatever was over there had already known their language for a long time. We have been watching you build this empire. We need to talk. The first thing Senvareth did was nothing. This was a deliberate choice. His officers expected a reaction. Weapons hot, defensive posture, the standard choreography of first contact with a potential threat. He let them expect it. He watched the shape on the display instead, studying the way it sat in space beside him. Not aggressive, not retreating, just present, the way a stone is present in a river, not swimming, not sinking, simply there while everything moves around it. Identify the transit method, he said quietly. We can't, said his sensor chief, a compact male named Orensil, whose tonal register was broadcasting pure bewilderment. There's no fold residue, no light speed deceleration wake, no phase entry scar. Admiral, it's as if it was always there, and we simply didn't notice it. That's not possible. No, sir. It isn't. Senvaritha's secondary tonal register, normally a smooth baseline of professional neutrality, produced a half note he hadn't intended. The tone veered between curiosity and unease. Open a channel, he said. The response was instantaneous. The face, if it could be called that appeared on screen was human. Senvarith had encountered human data files twice in his career. The species in question originated from a single star system located on the distant edge of the Empire's expansion map. Biologically fragile, the species was technologically adolescent, even by Imperial standards. They had been catalogued 40 years ago as a Class 4 civilization, pre-stellar, internally conflicted, and unlikely to pose any relevance to Imperial interests for at least 2 centuries. The catalog had clearly missed something. The human on screen was a woman. Her skin was a deep warm brown. Her eyes, just 2, perfectly forward-facing, a startling pale gray, looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully parse. She was calm, like the void. Absolutely still, not because there was no action but because every action was already accounted for. She wore no rank insignia, he recognized. Instead, across the collar of her dark uniform, there was a single embroidered symbol, a circle with a line through its center. Horizontal. It looked like a horizon. Admiral Senvarith, she said. Her voice came through the translator in clean Imperial harmonics, but beneath the translation, he could hear the original, a single channel, single tone language, no involuntary register, no embedded emotional signal. Completely opaque. My name is Commander Yoel Oren, of the Earth ship Meridian. Thank you for not firing. You gave me no time to, he said honestly. The edge of her mouth moved. That was intentional. Where did you come from? Earth. Though I imagine you mean how. She paused for exactly 1 breath. We'll explain the transit method if and when it becomes relevant. For now, what's relevant is this. Your expansion fleet reached the Keth-Soren border system 11 cycles ago. That system contains 6 inhabited planets. Your pacification doctrine is scheduled to begin in 43 days. How do you know our operational timeline? Admiral, she said. We've been in your sensor web for 19 years. The deck went silent. The silence wasn't the sound of people holding their breath. The silence was the result of people reorganizing their understanding of the past 19 years around a fact that fundamentally altered everything. Senvaritha's tertiary eye, the one that watched inward, blinked once. Slowly. Senvaritha's tertiary eye only blinked when a sense of fear began to permeate him. You've been inside our sensor web, he repeated. Inside it. Studying it. Learning it. She tilted her head very slightly. We didn't sabotage it. We didn't extract military intelligence for tactical advantage. We just watched. That should tell you something about why we're here. And why are you here? Because in 43 days, 6 inhabited planets get pacified, she said, and the word landed in the Velthara translator with a specific harmonic weight that meant she had chosen it deliberately, knowing how it sounded in their language. And because the last time an empire did that on a certain scale, in a certain pattern, it triggered something we've seen before. Something you haven't. And we're here to tell you what comes next. Behind Senvarith, Daraves whispered, Should I bring weapons online? He didn't answer her. He was looking at Yoel Oren's eyes, those pale gray eyes that had apparently been watching him through 19 years of history from somewhere inside the invisible architecture of his empire. Come aboard, he said. He didn't know why he said it. The The tertiary eye blinked again. The shuttle bay of the Undying Throne was designed to intimidate. This was standard Velthara diplomatic architecture. Every surface was polished to a reflective sheen, the walls curving overhead in a cathedral suite meant to evoke the interior of a Velthara ceremonial cave, the oldest and most sacred space in their cultural memory. The ambient lighting shifted from violet to deep indigo, frequencies that triggered instinctual deference responses in every species the Empire had encountered. Commander Yoel Oren walked in and looked around with the mild interest of someone visiting a moderately fascinating museum. She was alone.
She had insisted on that.
No security escort from the Meridian, no diplomatic aid, no weapon that any scan could identify, and they had scanned her 8 times by the time she reached the bay. Senvareth met her personally, which was irregular. He had sent Daraves in the preparation stage, and his protocol minister and 2 members of his intelligence staff, all of whom now stood behind him wearing expressions that ranged from professional neutrality to barely suppressed alarm. "I expected more of you," Oren said, looking at him directly. "I expected more of you as well," he replied, meaning the shuttle. "I don't need a shuttle," she said. He let that sit for a moment. "How did you board?" "The same way we arrived. We'll discuss the mechanics eventually. I promise the explanation is less impressive than the mystery and slightly more disturbing." She looked at his tertiary eye, the small black one at the back of his skull, which she could only see because she was tall enough and had clearly studied Velthara anatomy in detail. "That one watches you," she said. "Does it hurt?" "It doesn't have pain receptors." "That's not what I ask." A silence. His protocol minister made a small, uncomfortable sound. "Sometimes," Senvareth said. Oren nodded as though this was an answer she'd expected and respected.
"Honest."
"Good." She fell into step beside him as he turned toward the conference chamber. "I want to tell you something before we begin the formal briefing, Admiral. This information is not included in our official communication and will not be included in any record your intelligence staff creates of this meeting. Records are made automatically aboard this ship." "I know. I mean, it won't be in the records your intelligence staff shares afterward." She said it without threat, almost gently. "I want to tell you about a man named Doran." "One of your people?"
"No."
"He lived 11,000 years ago, on a continent that doesn't exist anymore, on a planet that your empire hasn't cataloged yet because it's entirely underground now. He led an empire."
She paused.
"Like yours. It was built on fold space logistics, sonic governance, and a sensor web that felt, to its architects, like perfect awareness." She glanced at him sideways. He thought he'd accounted for everything, too. Senvareth's secondary tone dipped involuntarily. "You're describing my empire." "I'm describing a pattern," she said. "Your empire fits the pattern."
"So, did Doran's."
"So did 4 others we've documented across different galaxies and different millennia."
"We call it the lattice collapse sequence."
"It has 7 stages. Your empire is currently in stage 5. "What is stage 6? She was quiet for exactly 3 of his heartbeats. "Internal fracture along expansion seams," she said. "When an empire built on perfect information control reaches a boundary where the information is too complex to process, multiple new cultures, multiple new languages, and multiple new psychological frameworks all arriving at once, the sensor web doesn't fail."
"It lies."
"Not through malice. Through the limitation of trying to translate everything into a single known framework. The empire starts believing its own misreadings. Decisions get made on false certainty." "And stage 7? They reached the conference chamber door. She stopped and turned to face him fully. "In Doran's case," she said, 12 billion people." She said it simply. No performance. No drama. The way you say a number that is so large it stops being a number and becomes a shape, the shape of something that cannot be undone. Senvareth's 6 primary eyes held her gaze. His tertiary eye, at the back of his skull, was completely still. "Come in," he said, and opened the door. The conference chamber had a table designed for 40 Velthara officers. 2 beings sat at it. Oren had brought something with her. Not a weapon, not a device. A small sealed cylinder, matte gray, that she placed at the center of the table without explanation and didn't open. Senvareth looked at it and decided not to ask yet. Timing, in Velthara culture, was a form of respect. The Kethsoran border system, he said. Why that specifically? We have absorbed 41 systems. We have pacified 11. Your people have not intervened before. We weren't ready before, she said. Ready for what? For you to listen. She folded her hands on the table, a gesture he now recognized as a human signal of deliberate openness, palms up in peripheral vision, a biological honesty display. Admiral, every interaction we have with the Stage 5 Empire fails if we arrive too early. You need to have reached a specific threshold of, I'll call it productive doubt. A moment where something in the leadership structure has already started questioning the model, even if they haven't named the question yet. You're saying I was already doubting something. I'm saying your tertiary I has been unusually active in your last 90 command cycles, she said. Your biology was already asking the question. We just came when the question was loud enough. He was quiet for a long moment. Outside, through the chamber's narrow viewport, the stars were their usual indifferent selves. It's the 6 planets, he said. What do you actually want? We want you to confront them. That's not. I know it's not simple, she said. I know the expansion doctrine is tied to resource logistics that are tied to 11 other systems that are tied to your core's energy dependency. I know pulling back at the Kethsoran border creates a vulnerability that 3 other frontier factions will read as weakness. I know your empire doesn't have a framework for voluntary restraint because in 400 years of expansion, restraint was never strategically rational. She hadn't raised her voice once. I know all of this, and I'm still asking you not to pacify them. Why? She reached forward and opened the gray cylinder. It projected nothing. Instead, the air above it filled with sound, layered, complex, shifting. A texture of audio frequencies that Senvaretha's primary ears couldn't fully separate into components. It wasn't music. It wasn't speech. It was something his auditory system registered as simultaneously entirely alien and deeply, disturbingly familiar. What is that? He said. That is what the Kethsoran send into space when they believe no one is listening. Oren said. We've been collecting it for 30 years. It's not communication. It's not a beacon. It's what they do when they're alone. She let it play for another moment. We don't have a full translation. We're not sure it can be fully translated. But we've identified 11 structural elements that correspond, loosely, imperfectly, to what your species does in ceremonial caves. What we call grief processing. Our earliest cultures referred to these as mourning songs. Senvareth listened. The sound moved through the chamber, like weather. They're already mourning, he said quietly. They've known you were coming for 6 cycles, she said. They started the songs 2 cycles in. They haven't stopped. She closed the cylinder, and the sound ended, leaving a silence that felt louder than before. They are not a primitive culture, Admiral. They have a different relationship to time, to lose, to anticipation, to understand what it means to be absorbed into something larger than yourself. She looked at him steadily. Pacification will work. It always works. 6 planets will be quiet and orderly and integrated, and the mourning songs will never be heard again. And 11,000 years from now, if there's anyone left to document it, they'll add it to the list of what was lost in Stage 6. You're asking me to make a decision my entire empire's structure argues against, he said. Yes. Based on the trajectory of a historical pattern, I have no way to independently verify it. Yes. And a sound. And a sound, she confirmed. He looked at the cylinder. What's in Stage 6, he said slowly, that you haven't told me yet? A beat. 1 full breath. The Stage 6 fracture, she said, doesn't begin at the borders. It begins with the leaders, with the specific cognitive failure that happens when someone who has built their identity around perfect information, perfect awareness, perfect control, encounters a reality their framework cannot process. She paused. It begins with tertiary eyes that stop blinking. Senvareth went completely still. What do you mean? It means the self-monitoring breaks down, she said quietly. The internal honesty function. The internal honesty function can be a source of pain. When the framework the empire runs on becomes more important than what the framework is showing you, the internal check gets overridden. Systematically, biologically, the leaders stop seeing themselves clearly. Her voice was careful, precise, not cruel. And then they start making decisions based on what the framework needs to be true rather than what is true. And then, 12 billion, he said. 12 billion, she said. The viewport held the stars. Senvaratha's tertiary eye blinked. Slowly, painfully. And he thought, so that is the question I've been asking myself for 90 cycles and couldn't name. The meeting lasted 11 hours. By hour 3, Senvarath had called in his logistics minister, a sharp-featured elder named Rethon Vaz, whose tonal register operated at a permanent frequency of practical skepticism. Rethon Vaz spent the first 40 minutes of his inclusion in the meeting making the precise strategic case for why Kethsoran pacification was not optional. Resource corridors, energy dependency chains, political signal costs, and frontier perception matrices. Oren listened to all of it. She asked 4 questions. Each question was about a specific detail, not the big strategic frame, but a small embedded assumption within it. After the 4th question, Rethon Vaz went quiet for a long time. You've modeled our resource systems, he said. For 17 years, she said. And you're saying the dependency chain from Kethsoran isn't actually load-bearing. I'm saying it was load-bearing at the time the doctrine was written. And that the Velthara energy grid has since changed in 3 ways that were never back integrated into the doctrine review, including shifts in energy distribution, the introduction of new energy sources, and changes in energy consumption patterns. The doctrine review process was suspended during the Outer Belt campaign. The campaign was prolonged due to its duration. The resistance timeline was misinterpreted by the censor web. She spread her hands on the table. The resource justification for Kethsoran is 32 years out of date. You've been operating on a map that no longer matches the territory. Rethon Vaz looked at his data screens. His secondary tonal register produced something Senvarath had never heard from him before, a frequency that in younger officers would have been called shame, but in Rethon Vaz, who had been too proud and too old for shame for 2 decades, came out as something more complicated, something more honest. That can't be verified in this room, he said. No, Oren agreed. It will take your analysts approximately 9 days to verify. We'll wait. You'll wait? We have time, she said simply. Your ship will just sit there, in our sensor range, for 9 days. We'll be completely visible, completely stationary, full sensor access. She almost smiled. No hiding. We're done hiding. That phase of our relationship is over. Senvarath had watched this exchange carefully, tracking Rethon Vaz, who was the single most influential voice in the Empire's expansion policy, and reading his tonal register with the precision of someone who had worked beside him for 30 years. The old logistics minister was afraid, not of Oren. He was not afraid of Oren nor of the meridian that was positioned within their sensor range. Not of strategic exposure. He was afraid of the 9 days. What the analysts would find in the 9 days. Of the possibility that a 32-year-old map had been quietly governing the largest empire in known space and nobody had checked it because nobody had thought to. 9 days, Rethon Vaz said finally. 9 days, Oren confirmed. He looked at Senvarath. Senvarath said nothing. He let his secondary tonal register do the work, a low, even frequency that in Velthara command culture meant. I've decided. Don't fight this one. Rethon Vaz dipped his head and left, jaw ridge lowered. By hour 7, the conversation had shifted to something Senvarath hadn't anticipated. Not strategy, not doctrine, not resource chains. Oren had started asking about the ceremonial caves. Not tactically, not academically. She asked it the way someone asks about something they have genuine reverence for. We have recordings, she said, from 30 years ago. The recordings date back to a time before we established contact protocol. The message came from a survey vessel that was within the range of your home system. She was careful in how she said it. We've studied the acoustic architecture of the caves, she said. 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 Of the caves,
she said.
Of the caves, she said, acting it. The acoustic architecture of the caves. She was referring to the way the sound travels. We've studied it for a long time. A pause.
What happens in them?
Could you please share that information with me? The question was unprecedented in a diplomatic context. Velthara's ceremonial life was not discussed with outside species. It was not that it was forbidden, there was no law against it. It was simply that in 400 years of expansion, no outside species had ever thought to ask. They asked about weapons ranges and treaty terms, as well as resource access. Nobody asked about the caves. Senvareth looked at her for a long moment. We process, he said finally, what cannot be processed elsewhere. He paused, searching for how to explain something that his language handled in sub-frequency implication. In command, in governance, in expansion, our secondary register is always performing. The secondary register consistently provides the correct signal. The caves are where the secondary register is turned off. This is the place where we can only express ourselves once.
Singly.
Without the double meaning. She said, there is a place where you can simply express what is. Yes. Where the tertiary eye can see without consequence. Yes. She nodded slowly. We have something like that, she said. Ours doesn't have a name in most of our languages. Some of the older ones do. One of them translates roughly as the place inside where you cannot lie to yourself. She looked at the gray cylinder, closed on the table between them. We think the Keth Soren morning songs are that. Their equivalent. A place they go when they have to be true. They broadcast it into space. They don't know anyone is listening, she said. Or they didn't. I think now they might. She met his eyes. I think now they might be broadcasting it at you. That landed differently than anything else she had said. Because it was possible. Because 6 planets, knowing what was coming, sending their grief processing into the void for 6 cycles. Was that despair? Or was it something else? Was it the impossible, irrational, biologically fundamental thing that Senvareth had studied in every species the Empire had ever catalogued, quietly noting it without ever knowing what to do with it? Was it hope? On the 4th day, Orin invited him aboard the Meridian. Senvareth went alone. Senvareth made a decision that alarmed his entire staff, yet he did so with the specific calmness of someone who has come to trust their instincts over their protocols. The transit method, when he finally experienced it, was nothing like fold space. It didn't compress distance. It did something that he lacked the conceptual framework to fully describe, even to himself. Later, in his private log, he would write, "It moved me through a place that is not adjacent to space. Not between 2 points, but beneath them, as if the universe has a basement and someone built a door." The Meridian was enormous inside. Not in the physical sense, the corridors were functional, not grand. Enormous in what it contained. It had a crew of 412 from 11 species. Not a crew in the Velthara sense, a complement of ranks and functions, a hierarchical instrument. More like a community that operated a warship. They ate together in a common area that was clearly not a cafeteria by design. It was too irregular, too decorated, and too accumulated with small meaningful objects and marks and modifications that spoke of years of habitation. How long has this crew been together? Senvareth asked. This configuration? 16 years, Orin said. Some members have been aboard for 30. Some came on 2 years ago. It shifts slowly. Your chain of command exists. Works differently than yours. She led him deeper into the ship. We spent about 200 years building hierarchical command structures modeled on conflict efficiency. We spent the next 100 years watching them generate the conflicts they were built to win. We've been iterating on alternatives ever since. She glanced back at him. We haven't solved it, but we've learned which problems are worth not solving quickly. They reached a room he hadn't expected. It was dark. It was not black, but rather a deep, layered darkness that exuded a warmth rather than a coldness. The room was irregularly shaped, with no flat surfaces, the walls curving in ways that had no structural logic, only acoustic logic. He realized with a slow, creeping recognition that the curve ratios were familiar. He had seen them before, calculated them before, and heard them described in terms of resonance harmonic geometry. They were ceremonial cave proportions, not copy-derived. These dimensions were determined through separate acoustic research conducted by a different culture. The same answer was reached from a different direction. We built one on every long-range vessel, Oren said quietly. We have designed a room where the secondary register is turned off. You are only allowed to speak once in this room. She stood in the doorway. She didn't enter. This, he understood, was deliberate. She wasn't inviting herself in. It took us an embarrassingly long time to understand why it was necessary. Senvereth stood in the room for a long time. Senvereth stood in the dark, surrounded by curved walls and a resonance that asked nothing of him and reflected nothing back. He thought about 90 cycles of a tertiary eye that had been asking a question he couldn't name. He thought about Rethanvaz and a 32-year-old map. He thought about morning songs broadcast into a void that had turned out not to be empty. He spoke aloud, in the secondary register that was turned off, in the single-channel voice that meant nothing except exactly what it said. I don't know if my empire deserves to continue. The walls absorbed it. Nothing echoed. That was the design. On the sixth day, the fracture showed itself. It came from within the undying throne's own ranks, which Senvereth had expected. What he hadn't expected was the specific shape it took. Tactical Commander Orithson, a career officer of 30 years, decorated twice, whose secondary tonal register had always broadcast the deep, even frequency of pure institutional loyalty, transmitted a tight beam signal on a frequency that the Meridian detected immediately and the Undying Throne's own counterintelligence division detected 4 hours later. The signal went to 3 of the 40 warships in the fleet. The content, when decoded, was 11 words. The human is a weapon. The Admiral has been compromised. Prepare contingency. Oren told Senvereth herself. She told him before his intelligence staff brought it to him, not because she wanted credit or leverage. She had been monitoring his ship for 19 years, during which she had developed a sense of who he was. He's not wrong that the presence of an outside influence creates a perception of compromise, she said. From inside his framework, this response is rational. You're defending him. I'm explaining him. A pause. What will you do? Senvereth sat with that for a long time. In Velthara command doctrine, the response was unambiguous. Unauthorized fleet communication constituted the first stage of a mutiny protocol. Orithson would be removed from command, detained, tried before the fleet tribunal, and almost certainly executed. The 3 ships that received the signal would have their commanders brought in for questioning. Decisive.
Clean.
The doctrine was clear because it had been written by people who understood that the first fracture, left unaddressed, formed the shape of all subsequent fractures. The doctrine says remove him, Senvereth said. Yes, Oren said. If I remove him, the 3 ships harden. They've received the signal. Removing him confirms to them that the signal was right, that something is wrong with command, that I am compromised. Yes. If I don't remove him, the doctrine fractures here. And doctrine, once fractured at the top, doesn't repair. It just develops new fault lines every time it bends. Yes, she said again.
Quiet.
Not offering a solution. He was merely verifying that he understood the situation accurately. What did Doran do? He asked. A long pause. Doran removed everyone who raised the concern, she said. Efficiently.
Completely.
His empire ran more smoothly for the following 18 years than it ever had. She let that breathe. That was stage 6. Senvereth looked at his hands. Velthara hands, four-fingered, the joints slightly inverted from how human hands bend, the skin a pale silver gray with a faint iridescent quality in direct light. He had spent his entire career trusting these hands to make difficult decisions quickly. I need to talk to Orithson, he said. Not a tribunal. Not a command summons. A conversation. Oren nodded. Will you come? He said. She looked at him with those pale gray eyes. It'll go better if I don't, she said. He nodded. He understood. He was beginning to understand that Oren was not managing him toward an outcome. She was not using wisdom as a tool of manipulation. She was doing something he had no institutional category for and had to build a new one to hold. She was being genuinely useful, without owning them. He went to find Orithsan. Senverith found Orithsan in the weapons bay, not doing anything suspicious, just standing near the primary array with his secondary hands clasped at the small of his back, the way old officers stood when they needed to think and found that thinking required proximity to something they understood completely. Senverith stood beside him for a while. Neither of them spoke. This was comfortable. They had served together for 22 years and had developed, across 2 decades of military bureaucracy, the specific ease of two people who did not need language to begin a difficult conversation. Eventually, Senverith said, "You think I've been compromised." Orithsan's secondary tone produced a frequency that was neither agreement nor denial. It was something more primary. The signal of a soldier who has seen something he can't unsee and is deciding whether to trust the person he's always trusted with what he saw. "You went aboard their ship," Orithsan said. "Yes." "Alone." "Yes." "And you came back." A pause. The tonal register dipped into something uncomfortable. Different. Different how? Orithsan turned his full eye cluster towards Senverith for the first time. He saw all 6 violet eyes, the amber pair, and the familiar constellation of a face he had read for 22 years. "You're asking questions," Orithsan said. "You've never asked questions like this before. You've always decided. That's what made you the best commander I've served under. You gathered information and you decided, and you didn't revisit."
You didn't, he stopped.
His secondary tone produced a frequency that Senverith translated, with some surprise, as grief. "You didn't look uncertain." "I am uncertain," Senverith said.
About what?
"About whether the decisions I've been making have been good ones." Silence. "That is compromise," Orithsan said. "Not as an accusation. As a diagnosis." The secondary tone held something close to pain. "Or its accuracy," Senverith said quietly. "Orithsan, when was the last time you verified the resource doctrine for the Kethsoran expansion?" "Not the summary. The original modeling." I'd have to access the base files." "When were they last reviewed?" The silence continued for a considerable amount of time, eventually forming its own response. "The human showed you something," Orithsan said. "The human showed me a question I should have asked myself 30 years ago." Senverith turned to face him fully. "She didn't compromise me. She made me more accurate. That's not the same thing." "A beat." "Orithsan, I know what you signaled. I know which ships received it. I am not going to convene a tribunal." The old officer went very still. "The question isn't whether your instinct to protect the Empire was right," Senverith said. "It was right. The question is whether the Empire you're protecting is the one we actually have, or the one the doctrine says we should have. Those have stopped being the same thing." He held the other man's gaze. "I need you to verify the Kethsoran resource modeling with me. Personally. The base files. Not the summary." He paused. "And I need you to do it before you decide whether I'm still the commander you trust." Orithsan was quiet for a very long time. His tertiary eye, the small, inward-looking one, blinked.
"Once."
"All right," he said. The analysts finished in 8. The results were not dramatic in their presentation. A series of updated projections, corrected dependency chains, and revised load models, but their implication was seismic and quiet at the same time, the way a geological survey can tell you that the ground you've been standing on has been slowly moving for 40 years without you noticing. The Kethsoran resource rationale was not load-bearing. The Kethsoran resource rationale had not been in place for 29 years. The doctrine had been maintained because it had never been formally challenged, and it had never been formally challenged because the expansion momentum of the Empire created a systemic pressure in which questioning a working doctrine felt, institutionally, like sabotage. Not because anyone wanted it to feel that way. That was how Stage 5 appeared from the inside. Rithon Vaz presented the findings to the Fleet Command in a voice that, for the first time in Senverith's experience, conveyed absolute, unmediated humility. Not performed. Not strategic. The real frequency. There was a silence after the presentation. Then the questions. Then the pushback. Then there is a longer silence that follows when the pushback runs out of substance. Orithsan, seated at the far end of the command table, said nothing during the whole proceeding.
He watched.
At the end, when Senverith looked at him directly, he dipped his jaw ridge once, the signal that in Velthra body language meant I was wrong about the specific thing, and right about the underlying concern, and I was holding both at the same time. Senverith issued a holding order on the Kethsoran expansion. Not a cancellation. Not a retreat. A hold, with a commission to re-examine the full doctrine set against verified current data rather than historical projections. This was the type of administrative action that would be considered routine in a healthy empire. In this empire, at this moment, this was the most radical thing he had done in 30 years of command. He informed Orin personally. She received it without celebration. "You know this doesn't end the pattern," she said. "I know. A holding order can be reversed. The next admiral may lack a tertiary eye that blinks. I know that too." He looked at her steadily. "What do you want from this?" "Not diplomatically. Not institutionally. You, Orin. 19 years of watching. 8 days of waiting. Could you please clarify what you hope to achieve from this?" She looked at him for a long time. "I want to find out if it's possible," she said. "That's genuinely all. We've documented 6 collapsed empires. We've arrived at 3 others too late. We've arrived at 2 in stage 3, too early, and they didn't hear us. You're the first stage 5 contact we've made where the door was open." She paused. "I want to find out if the sequence can be interrupted. If history isn't a fixed track, can it be interrupted? A beat. I want to know if what Doran couldn't do is something a different leader in a different empire can do. Not because it saves your empire specifically. If such a feat is achieved once, it implies a certain level of intelligence's potential. Any intelligence. Any species. It means we're not just a pattern," he said. "Yes," she said. "Exactly that." Senverith made one further decision that was not in any doctrine. He took the gray cylinder, which Orin had left aboard the Undying Throne without comment on the second day, to the communications array. He opened it. He let the morning songs play into the Empire's sensor web at full broadcast capacity, in every direction, on every active frequency. Not as a signal, not as a message, not as diplomacy, just letting the Kethsoran know that someone had been listening. What came back, 3 days later, was unexpected. It was not the same songs. It was not morning. It was something the translation software spent a full day trying to categorize before one of the junior analysts, a young female officer named Senorith, who had joined the fleet 18 months ago and had a habit of asking questions that made her seniors uncomfortable, submitted a notation that the translation software wasn't failing to categorize it. It was simply that the category it belonged to was one they'd never indexed. "What category?" Senverith asked. Senorith looked at her screen. "The closest structural analog in our own cultural archive," she said carefully, "is the tonal pattern we use at the end of a long isolation. When someone comes back." She paused. "It's a greeting for someone you weren't sure was going to come back." Senverith sat with the statement for a while. "Not surprised," he said. "No, sir." "No surprise." She hesitated. More like relief that a hope they held without evidence turned out to have been the right thing to hold. He nodded slowly. He thought about Orin's gray eyes watching him across a table for 8 days. He envisioned a room on the Meridian that was as large as a cave. About a tertiary eye that had been asking a question for 90 cycles. About 6 planets singing into a void, and the void singing something back. Orin left on the 9th day. No ceremony. Senverith was not under the impression that a formal treaty would be simple. It would come later, through slower diplomatic channels. The 3 ships whose commanders had received Orithsan's signal would need careful management to ensure they operated effectively in the uncertain political climate and to prevent any misinterpretations of their actions by rival factions. The Expansion Doctrine Commission would face institutional resistance from 6 directions, including opposition from political factions, bureaucratic inertia, public skepticism, resource limitations, competing priorities, and external pressures from rival entities. The frontier factions watching the Kethsoran holding order would read it as weakness for at least 2 years before the strategic picture clarified, leading to potential challenges in maintaining control and support from allied forces during that period. There was no clean resolution. There was only a different direction. Orin shook his hand before she left, A human contact gesture that he had researched enough to understand was not casual. It meant something about the specific materiality of the moment. It signified that two individuals, occupying distinct frameworks, were momentarily uniting within one. "One question," Senvareth said, "before you go." "Yes." "The transit method, the basement beneath space. How did you find it?" She was quiet for a moment. "It was an accident," she said. "We were trying to solve a completely different problem, energy generation, not transit. A physicist named Rio made a mistake in a containment calculation. The mistake opened something. She spent the next 20 years figuring out what she'd opened." A pause. "We almost weaponized it. We had a very long argument about that." Her voice was careful, honest. The argument was ugly. It took about 40 years, and it left marks. But we came out the other side with a transit method instead of a weapon. 40 years of argument, he said. Messy. Expensive.
"Worth it," she said.
The messiness was the point. Anything that gets decided cleanly in institutions tends to get decided in favor of the institution. She tilted her head. "Ask your tertiary eye." He almost laughed. He wasn't sure his biology supported laughter in the human sense. The Velthera expression of sudden recognition pleasure was a chest vibration at a specific harmonic, but something close to it moved through him. She left. The meridian became visible for exactly 3 seconds on their sensors, a hard, clear, solid return signal, fully readable, as if it wanted to be seen one last time. And then it was gone. Not folded away. Not transited. Gone, the way something goes when it passes beneath the floor of the room rather than through the door. Senvareth stood at the sensor display for a while. Then he went to find Senorith, the junior analyst who asked uncomfortable questions. "I want to open a working group," he said. "Not in the doctrine structure. Unofficial. I want people who are good at asking questions the sensor web isn't designed to ask." He paused. Questions about what we're misreading. About where the map has stopped matching the territory. She looked at him with the cautious interest of someone who has learned that in empires, being the person who asks uncomfortable questions has a historically poor career trajectory. "What would we be authorized to examine?" she asked. "Everything," he said. She blinked all 4 of her eyes. She was young enough that her tertiary eye was still developing the independent mobility that would come with age. "Everything," she repeated. "Everything we've decided is based on doctrine that hasn't been verified against current data in more than a decade." He looked at her steadily. "We start with Keth Soren. We don't stop there." "That's..." She calculated something. "That's a lot." "Yes," he said. "It is." 43 days after the meridian materialized from nowhere alongside the undying throne, the 6 planets of the Keth Soren border system were still inhabited by the people who had always lived there. They were still singing. The songs had changed. They were not mourning anymore, or not only mourning. They were more complex and harder to categorize, and Senorith's new working group was documenting them with the specific care that comes from knowing they were recording something that had never existed in this form before. Senvareth stood in his private chamber, not the ceremonial cave. He had no access to one aboard ship, but the closest equivalent he had been able to construct with what was available, and listen to the recordings. Not tactically, not analytically, just listening. He was thinking about a question Oren had asked him in the conference chamber during the 8th hour of their first meeting. Quietly, between larger topics, almost as an aside. "What does your empire want to be remembered for?" He had said the standard answer. Stability. Order. The resolution of conflicts is achieved through the implementation of unified governance. She had nodded and moved on, and he had thought nothing of it. He thought about it now, because the standard answer was not wrong, exactly. But it was the answer to someone reading the map. It was the answer the doctrine had prepared him to give. It was the answer that sounded, in the secondary register, like confidence, like certainty, while the primary channel, the single honest one, produced something quieter and more complicated. What do you want to be remembered for? The primary channel question. The cave question. The question was single-toned, with the secondary register off and the tertiary eye fully open. He didn't answer it. Not yet. That was all right. He was becoming comfortable with questions that didn't have an immediate answer, with the idea that sitting inside an open question, without forcing it closed, was not weakness and not uncertainty, and not compromise. It was something else. Something he didn't have a word for in Imperial, but suspected existed in the Kethsoran songs. Suspected existed in the room aboard the Meridian with the cave proportions. Suspected existed in the 40 years of ugly argument that turned an accidental discovery into a door instead of a weapon. The sound of beings sitting with what they don't yet know and choosing, in that not knowing, to lean towards something they can't quite see. He supposed, in the language Orin had used so carefully and so precisely throughout their 9 days. He supposed that was what a horizon was. And,